Good evening, monster children, and welcome to the Kaiju Krypt. I am your host, Vinnie Kami. Tonight is the night. The veil between the natural and the unnatural worlds is pulled back like a curtain, when yokai, with permission from their benevolent kami masters, have free rein to revel in celebration in your mortal realm. Some would even say it is their holiest of days. Isn't that right, Kappa Joe?
I ain't no Kappa, no Cap, yo.
A talking plant? Who the Jigoko are you?
Yo, you can call me by my main character moniker, Violet, or Vi for short.
How do you have a male voice, but a female name?
My statement, my gender choice, Boomer. I'm more skibbity than the toilet.
Skibbity toilet? That unholy abomination was cast out of the yokai community after he drove Akamanto insane.
Are you the Lulu? I ain't no yokai. I'm a mean green mother. Shut your mouth from outer space.
Enough! Where is Kappa Joe?
Ah! Stop tweaking. My ears.
You're a plant. You don't have ears.
Sheesh. Don't be such a total cringe vibe killer. Kappa Joe, it took a vacay, bro.
I am not your brother.
Chugi, you said yourself that tonight's when yokai had the most fun. Joe is total Capricorn for real.
He gave himself the night off. Of course.
POV, Kappa Joe gives you some busted raw steak before dropping you off to fill in for the Kaiju Krypt. He is the GOAT.
If I understand your alien language, Kappa Joe arranged for his sentient meat-eating houseplant to be his substitute on tonight's show.
Bet.
I am getting too old for this Kuso. Go fetch tonight's reader.
Yo, you expect me to yeet myself around, yo?
Whatever that is, just do it.
Oof.
Perhaps it's fate that a plant is subbing for Kappa Joe, for our story features such a creature. That story is Green Thoughts by John Collier. This darkly humorous tale, which was first published in the May 1931 issue of Harper's Magazine, shows the deadly consequences of obsession for one lowly collector. It was republished in 1951 in an award-winning book titled Fancies and Good Nights. The London-born Collier was famous for his short stories, but also screenplays like 1951's The African Queen, starring Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn. His style, which some have described as smiling misanthropy, has influenced the likes of Kaiju Krypt alum Ray Bradbury, Willy Wonka creator Roald Dahl, and that monster himself, Neil Gaiman. But most importantly, Green Thoughts likely inspired Charles B. Griffith to write a screenplay for Roger Corman called The Passionate People Eater, which, in 1960, became The Little Shop of Horrors. This cult classic would pave the way for a happily nihilistic stage musical, which itself became a film in 1986, directed by Frank Oz and starred Rick Moranis. What a glorious family tree.
Someone say tree? Plants got a rep. Ha ha! So fire.
Where's our reader?
He's waiting in the booth. What a Chad.
His name isn't Chad. It is Gary Steward, monster children, paralegal at the Monster Island Legal Action Team. Yes, the assistant, the sidekick, if you will, for the venerable Raymond Martin, who read a story last Halloween. We invited Mr. Steward to read this year because he bears a certain resemblance to Seymour, the foppish hero of Green Thoughts, stage and cinematic descendants.
Did I mention I'm a theater kid? Well, sapling, my parent hates me for this. He wants me to continue the family business of world domination. I keep telling him, just take the L. Ha ha, so dank.
Excuse me while I locate an ancient tome that translates what this Biolante imitator...
Yes, Queen, slay. She's my idol. Lit.
What he is saying. Enjoy this tale of mania, murder, and ravenous appetite.
Hi. I've never done something like this before. Well, I've been on the radio before. Raymond likes to go on the Monster Island Film Vault, and I kind of have to be there to reel him in when he starts getting weird. And sometimes Raymond goes on the Murdoch's Law podcast to discuss legal cases involving superheroes. But this is the first time I've been asked to be a guest. I'm so nervous. That's why I brought Della Allred with me. She's an orange cat I got for Crystal Lady a while back, but she adopted a fairy moth friend, Mimo, so I got stuck with Della. I was going to send her back to the mainland, but, well, she calms me down after a stressful day as a paralegal. And as a sidekick, yeah, well, you get it. So, Green Thoughts. I always like Little Shop of Horrors. Seymour is my spirit animal, I guess you could say. Maybe one day I'll have an Audrey in my life. Audrey 1, not 2. Audrey 2 can stay in the beta site with all the other weird monsters. But let's start reading. You stay over there, Della. Good girl. Green Thoughts by John Collier. Annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. Marvel. The orchid had been sent among the many effects of his friend who had come by a lonely and mysterious death on the expedition. Or he had bought it amongst a miscellaneous lot, unclassified, at the close of the auction. I forget which it was, but it was certainly one or the other of these. Moreover, even in its dry, brown, dormant root state, this orchid had a certain sinister quality. It looked, with its bunched and ragged projections, like a rigid yet gripping hand, hideously gnarled, or a grotesquely whiskered, threatening face. Would you not have known what sort of an orchid it was? Mr. Mannering did not know. He read nothing but catalogues and books on fertilizers. He unpacked the new acquisition with a solicitude absurd enough in its case toward any orchid, or primrose either, in the 20th century, but idiotic, foolhardy, doom-eager when extended to an orchid just come by in appearance thus. And in his traditional obtuseness, he at once planted it in what he called the observation ward, a hothouse built against the south wall of his dumpy red dwelling. Here he set always the most interesting additions to his collection, and especially weak and sickly plants, for there was a glass door in his study wall through which he could see into this hothouse, so that the weak and sickly plants could encounter no crisis without his immediate knowledge and his tender care. This plant, however, proved hardy enough. At the ends of thick and stringy stalks, it opened out bunches of darkly shining leaves, and soon it spread in every direction, usurping so much space that first one, then another, then all its neighbors had to be removed to a hothouse at the end of the garden. It was, Cousin Jane said, a regular hop vine. At the ends of the stalks, just before the leaves began, were set groups of tendrils, which hung idly, serving no apparent purpose. Mr. Mannering thought that very probably these were vestigial organs, a heritage from some period when the plant had been a climber. But when were the vestigial tendrils of an ex-climber half or quarter so thick and strong? After a long time, sets of tiny buds appeared here and there among the extravagant foliage. Soon, they opened into small flowers, miserable little things. They looked like flies' heads. One naturally expects a large, garish, sinister bloom, like a sea anemone, or a Chinese lantern, or a hippopotamus yawning on any important orchid. And should it be an unclassified one as well, I think one has every right to insist on a sickly and overpowering scent into the bargain. Mr. Mannering did not mind at all. Indeed, apart from his joy and happiness in being the discoverer and godfather of a new sort of orchid, he felt only a mild and scientific interest in the fact that the paltry blooms were so very much like flies' heads. Could it be to attract other flies for food, or as fertilizers? But then, why like their heads? It was a few days later that Cousin Jane's cat disappeared. This was a great blow to Cousin Jane, but Mr. Mannering was not, in his heart of hearts, greatly sorry. He was not fond of the cat, for he could not open the smallest chink in a glass roof for ventilation, but the creature would squeeze through somehow to enjoy the warmth, and in this way it had broken many a tender shoot. But before poor Cousin Jane had lamented 2 days, something happened which so engrossed Mr. Mannering that he had no mind left at all with which to sympathize with her affliction, or to make at breakfast kind and hypocritical inquiries after the lost cat. A strange new bud appeared on the orchid. It was clearly evident that there would be 2 quite different sorts of bloom on this one plant, as sometimes happens in such fantastic corners of the vegetable world, and that the new flower would be very different in size and structure from the earlier ones. It grew bigger and bigger, till it was just as big as one's fist. And just then, it could never have been more inopportune, an affair of the most unpleasant, the most distressing nature summoned Mr. Mannering to town. It was his wretched nephew, in trouble again, and this time so deeply and so very disgracefully that it took all Mr. Mannering's generosity and all his influence, too, to extricate the worthless young man. Indeed, as soon as he saw the state of affairs, he told the prodigal that this was the very last time he might expect assistance, that his vices and his ingratitude had long ago cancelled all affection between them, and that for this last helping hand he was indebted only to his mother's memory, and to no faith on the part of his uncle, either in his repentance or his reformation. He wrote, moreover, to Cousin Jane to relieve his feelings, telling her of the whole business, and adding that the only thing left to do was to cut the young man off entirely. When he got back to Torquay, Cousin Jane was nowhere to be found. The situation was extremely annoying. Their only servant was a cook who was very old and very stupid and very deaf. She suffered besides from an obsession, owing to the fact that for many years Mr. Mannering had had no conversation with her in which he had not included an impressive reminder that she must always, no matter what might happen, keep the big kitchen stove up to a certain pitch of activity. For this stove, besides supplying the house with hot water, heated the pipes in the observation ward, to which the daily gardener who had charge of the other hothouses had no access. By this time, she had come to regard her duties as stoker as her chief raison d'etre, and it was difficult to penetrate her deafness with any question which her stupidity and her obsession did not somehow transmute into an inquiry after the stove, and this, of course, was especially a case when Mr. Mannering spoke to her. All he could disentangle was what she had volunteered on first seeing him, that his cousin had not been seen for 3 days, that she had left without saying a word. Mr. Mannering was perplexed and annoyed, but being a man of method, he thought it best to postpone further inquiries until he had refreshed himself a little after his long and tiring journey. A full supply of energy was necessary to extract any information from the old cook. Besides, there was probably a note somewhere. It was only natural that before he went to his room, Mr. Mannering should peep into the hothouse, just to make sure that the wonderful orchid had come to no harm during the inconsiderate absence of Cousin Jane. As soon as he opened the door, his eyes fell upon the bud. It had now changed in shape very considerably, and had increased in size to the bigness of a human head. It was no exaggeration to state that Mr. Mannering remained rooted to the spot, with his eyes fixed upon this wonderful bud for fully 5 minutes. But, you will ask, why did he not see her clothes on the floor? Well, as a matter of fact, it is a delicate point, there were no clothes on the floor. Cousin Jane, though of course she was entirely estimable in every respect, though she was well over 40 too, was given to the practice of the very latest ideas on the dual culture of the soul and the body. Swedish, German, Neo-Greek and all that, and the orchid house was the warmest place available. I must proceed with the order of events. Mr. Mannering at length withdrew his eyes from the stupendous bud, and decided as he must devote his attention to the grey exigencies of everyday life. But although his body dutifully ascended the stairs, heart, mind, and soul all remained in adoration of the plant. Although he was philosophical to the point of insensibility over the miserable smallness of the earlier flowers, yet he was now as much gratified by the magnitude of the great new bud as you or I might be. Hence, it was not unnatural that Mr. Mannering, while in his bath, should be full of the most exalted visions of the blossoming of his heart's darling, his vegetable godchild. It would be by far the largest known, complex as a dream, or dazzlingly simple. It would open like a dancer, or like the sun rising. Why, it might be opening at this very moment. Mr. Mannering could restrain himself no longer. He rose from the steamy water, and wrapping his bathrobe about him, hurried down to the hothouse, scarcely staying to dry himself, though he was subject to colds. The bud had not yet opened. It still reared its unbroken head among the glossy, fleshy foliage, and he now saw, what he had had no eyes for previously, how very exuberant that foliage had grown. Suddenly he realized with astonishment that this huge bud was not the one which had appeared before he went away. That one had been lower down on the plant. Where was it now, then? Why, this new thrust and spread of foliage concealed it from him. He walked across and discovered it. It had opened into a bloom. And as he looked at this bloom, his astonishment grew to stupefaction, one might say to petrification, for it is a fact that Mr. Mannering remained rooted to the spot, with his eyes fixed on the flower, for fully 15 minutes. The flower was an exact replica of the head of Cousin Jane's lost cat. The similitude was so exact, so lifelike, that Mr. Mannering's first movement after the 15 minutes was to seize his bathrobe and draw it about him, for he was a modest man, and the cat, though bought for a tome, had proved to be quite the reverse. I relate this to show how much character, spirit, presence, call it what you will, there was upon this floral cat's face. But although he made to seize his bathrobe, it was too late. He could not move. The new lusty foliage had closed in unperceived. The too lightly dismissed tendrils were everywhere upon him. He gave a few weak cries and sank to the ground, and there, as the Mr. Mannering of ordinary life, he passes out of this story. Mr. Mannering sank into a coma. into an insensibility so deep that a black eternity passed before the first faint elements of his consciousness reassembled themselves in his brain. For of his brain was the center of a new bud being made. Indeed, it was 2 or 3 days before this, at first almost hopeless and quite primitive lump of organic matter had become sufficiently mature to be called Mr. Mannering at all. These days, which passed quickly enough in a certain mild, not unpleasant excitement in the outer world, seemed to the dimly working mind within the bud to resume the whole history of development of our species in a great many epochal parts. A process analogous to the mutations of the embryo was being enacted here. At last the entity which thus being rushed down an absurdly foreshortened vista of the ages slowed up and came almost to a stop in the present. It became recognizable. The 7 ages of Mr. Mannering were presented, as it were, in a series of close-ups, as in an educational film. His consciousness settled and cleared. The bud was mature, ready to open. At this point, I believe, Mr. Mannering's state of mind was exactly that of a patient who, awakening from under an anesthetic, struggling up from vague dreams, asks plaintively, "Where am I?" Then the bud opened, and he knew. There was the hothouse, but seen from an unfamiliar angle. There, through the glass door, was his study. There, below him, was the cat's head, and there beside him, was Cousin Jane. He could not say a word, but then neither could she. Perhaps it was just as well. At the very least, he would have been forced to own that she had been right in an argument of long standing. She had always maintained that in the end no good could come of his preoccupation with those unnatural flowers. It must be admitted that Mr. Mannering was not at first greatly upset by this extraordinary upheaval in his daily life. This, I think, was because he was interested not only in private and personal matters, but in the wider and more general, one must say, the biological aspects of his metamorphosis. For the rest, simply because he was now a vegetable, he responded with a vegetable reaction. The impossibility of locomotion, for example, did not trouble him in the least, or even the absence of body and limbs, any more than the cessation of that stream of rashers and tea, biscuits and glasses of milk, luncheon and cutlets, and so forth, that had flowed in at his mouth for over 50 years, but which had now been reversed to a gentle, continuous, scarcely noticeable feeding from below. All the powerful influence of that physical upon the mental, therefore, inclined him to tranquility. But the physical was not all. Although no longer a man, he was still Mr. Mannering, and from this anomaly, as soon as his scientific interests had subsided, issued a host of woes, mainly subjective in origin. He was fretted, for instance, by the thought that he would now have no opportunity to name his orchid, or to write a paper upon it, and still worse, there grew up in his mind the abominable conviction that as soon as his plight was discovered, it was he who would be named and classified, and that he himself would be the subject of a paper, possibly even a comment and criticism in the lay press. Like all orchid collectors, he was excessively shy and sensitive, and in his present situation, these qualities were very naturally exaggerated, so that the bare idea of such attentions brought him to the verge of wilting. Worse yet was the fear of being transplanted, thrust into some unfamiliar, drafty, probably public place, being dug up. Oh! A violent shudder pulsated through all the heavy foliage that sprang from Mr. Mannering's division of the plant. He became conscious of a ghostly yet remote sensations in the stem below, and in certain tufts of leaves that sprouted from it. They were somehow reminiscent of spine and hearts and limbs. He felt quite the dryad. In spite of all, however, the sunshine was very pleasant. The rich odor of hot, spicy earth filled the hothouse. From a special fixture on the hot water pipes, a little warm steam oozed into the air. Mr. Mannering began to abandon himself of a feeling of laissez-aller. Just then, up in a corner of the glass roof at the ventilator, he heard a persistent buzzing. Soon, the note changed to one of irritation to a more complacent sound. A bee had managed, after some difficulty, to find his way through one of the tiny chinks in the metalwork. The visitor came drifting down and down through the still green air, as if into some subaqueous world, and he came to rest on one of those petals which were Mr. Mannering's eyebrows. Thence he commenced to explore one feature after another, and at last he settled heavily on the lower lip, which drooped under his weight and allowed him to crawl right into Mr. Mannering's mouth. This was quite a considerable shock, of course, but on the whole the sensation was neither as alarming nor as unpleasant as might have been expected. Indeed, thought the vegetable gentleman, it seems quite agreeable. But Mr. Mannering soon ceased the drowsy analysis of his sensations when he saw the departed bee, after one or two lazy circlings, settle directly upon the maiden lip of Cousin Jane. Ominous as lightning, a simple botanical principle flashed across the mind of her wretched relative. Cousin Jane was aware of it also, although, being the product of an earlier age, she might have remained still blessedly ignorant had not her cousin, vain, garrulous, proselytizing fool, attempted for years past to interest her in the rudiments of botany. How the miserable man upbraided himself now! He saw two bunches of leaves just below the flower tremble and flutter, and rear themselves painfully upwards into the very likeness of two shocked and protesting hands. He saw the soft and orderly petals of his cousin's face ruffle and incarnadine with rage and embarrassment, then turn sickly as a gardenia with horror and dismay. But what was he to do? All the rectitude implanted by his careful training, all the chivalry proper to an orchid collector, boiled and surged beneath the paralytically calm exterior. He positively travailed in the effort to activate the muscles of his face, to assume an expression of grief, manly contrition, helplessness in the face of fate, willingness to make honorable amends, all suffused with the light of a vague but solacing optimism. But it was in vain. When he had strained till his nerves seemed likely to tear under the tension, the only movement he could achieve was a trivial flutter of the left eyelid. Worse than nothing. This incident completely aroused Mr. Mannering from his vegetable lethargy. He rebelled against the limitations of the form into which he had thus been cast, while subjectively he remained all too human. Was he not still at heart a man, with a man's hopes, ideals, aspirations, and capacity for suffering? When dusk came, and the opulent and sinister shapes of the great plant dimmed into a suggestiveness more powerfully impressive than had been its bright noonday luxuriance, and the atmosphere of a tropical forest filled the orchid house like an exile's dream, or the nostalgia of the saxophone, when the cat's whiskers drooped, and even Cousin Jane's eyes slowly closed, the unhappy man remained wide awake, staring into the gathering darkness. Suddenly, the light in the study was switched on. Two men entered the room. One of them was his lawyer. The other was his nephew. "This is his study, as you know, of course," said the wicked nephew. "There's nothing here. I looked when I came over on Wednesday." "I've sat in his room many an evening," said the lawyer with an expression of distaste. "I'd sit on this side of the fireplace and he on that. Mannering, I'd think to myself, I wonder how you'll end up. Drugs, sexual perversion, or murder? Well, maybe we'll soon know the answer. Until we do, I suppose you, as next of kin, had better take charge here." Saying this, the lawyer turned, about to go, and Mr. Mannering saw the malicious smile overspread the young man's face. The uneasiness which had overcome him at first sight of his nephew was intensified to fear and trembling at the sight of this smile. When he had shown the lawyer out, the nephew returned to the study and looked round him with lively and sinister satisfaction. Then he cut a caper on the hearth rug. Mr. Mannering thought he had never seen anything so diabolical as this solitary expression of the glee of a venomous nature at the prospect of unchecked sway here whence he had been outcast. How vulgar petty triumph appeared, beheld thus. How disgusting petty spite, how appalling revengefulness and hardness of heart. He remembered suddenly that his nephew had been notable in his repulsive childhood for his cruelty to flies, tearing their wings off, and for his barbarity toward cats. A sort of dew might have been noticed upon the good man's forehead. It seemed to him that his nephew had only to glance that way, and all would be discovered, although he might have remembered that it was impossible to see from the lighted room into the darkness of the hothouse. On the mantelpiece stood a large, unframed photograph of Mr. Mannering. His nephew soon caught sight of this, and strode across to confront it with a triumphant and insolent sneer. "What, you old Pharisee," he said, "taking her off for a trip to Brighton, have you? My God, how I hope you'll never come back! How I hope you've fallen over the cliffs, or got swept off by the tide or something. Anyway, I'll make hay while the sun shines. Ah, you old skinflint, you!" And he reached forward his hand and bestowed a contemptuous fillip upon the nose of the photograph. Then the usurping rascal left the room, leaving all the lights on, presumably preferring the dining room with its cellaret to the scholarly austerities of the study. All night long the glare of electric light from the study fell upon Mr. Mannering and his cousin Jane, like the glare of a cheap and artificial sun. You who have seen at midnight in the park a few insomniac asters standing stiff and startled under an arc light, all their weak color bleached out of them by the drenching chemical radiance, neither asleep nor awake, but held fast in a tense, a neurasthenic trance, you can form an idea of how the night passed with this unhappy pair. And toward morning an incident occurred, trivial in itself, no doubt, but sufficient then and there to add the last drop to poor Cousin Jane's discomfiture and to her relative's embarrassment and remorse. Along the edge of the great earth box in which the orchid was planted ran a small black mouse. It had wicked red eyes, a naked evil snout, and huge repellent ears, queer as a bat's. This creature ran straight over to the lower leaves of the Cousin Jane's part of the plant. It was simply appalling. The stringy main stem writhed like a hair on a coal fire. The leaves contracted in an agonized spasm, like seared mimosa. The terrified lady nearly uprooted herself in her convulsive horror. I think she would have actually done so, had not the mouse hurried on past her. But it had not gone more than a foot or so when it looked up and saw, bending over it, and seeming positively to bristle with life, that flower which had once been called Tib. There was a breathless pause. The mouse was obviously paralyzed with terror. The cat could only look and long. Suddenly, the more human watchers saw a sly frond of foliage curve softly outward and close in behind the hypnotized creature. Cousin Jane, who had been thinking exultantly, "Well, now it'll go away and never, never, never come back," suddenly became aware of hideous possibilities. Summoning all her energy, she achieved a spasmodic flutter, enough to break the trance that held the mouse, so that, like a clockwork toy, it swung round and fled. But already the fell arm of the orchid had cut off its retreat. The mouse leaped straight at it. Like a flash, 5 tendrils at the end caught the fugitive and held it fast, and soon its body dwindled and was gone. Now the heart of Cousin Jane was troubled with horrid fears, and slowly and painfully she turned her weary face first to one side, then to the other, in a fever of anxiety as to where the new bud would appear. A sort of sucker, green and sappy, which twisted lightly about her main stem and reared a blunt head, much like a tip of asparagus close to her own, suddenly began to swell in the most suspicious manner. She squinted at it, fascinated and appalled. Could it be her imagination? It was not. Next evening the door opened again, and again the nephew entered the study. This time he was alone, and it was evident that he had come straight from table. He carried in his hand a decanter of whiskey capped by an inverted glass. Under his arm was a siphon. His face was distinctly flushed, and such a smile as is often seen in saloon bars played about his lips. He put down his burdens and, turning to Mr. Mannering's cigar cabinet, produced a bunch of keys, which he proceeded to try upon the lock, muttering vindictively at each abortive attempt, until it opened, when he helped himself from the best of its contents. Annoying as it was to witness this insolent appropriation of his property, and mortifying to see the contempt with which a cigar was smoked, the good gentleman found deeper cause for uneasiness in the thought that, with the possession of the keys, his abominable nephew had access to every private corner that was his. At present, however, the usurper seemed indisposed to carry on investigations. He splashed a great deal of whiskey into the tumbler and relaxed into an attitude of extravagant comfort. But after a while, the young man began to tire of his own company. He had not yet had time to gather any of his pothouse companions into his uncle's home, and repeated recourse to the whiskey bottle only increased his longing for something to relieve the monotony. His eye fell upon the door of the orchid house. Sooner or later it was bound to have happened. Does the thought greatly console the condemned man when the fatal knock sounds upon the door of his cell? No. Nor were the hearts of the trembling pair in the hothouse at all comforted by the reflection. As the nephew fumbled with the handle of the glass door, Cousin Jane slowly raised 2 fronds of leaves that grew on each side, high upon her stem, and sank her troubled head behind them. Mr. Mannering observed, in a sudden rapture of hope, that by this device she was fairly well concealed from any casual glance. Hastily he strove to follow her example. Unfortunately, he had not yet gained sufficient control of his limbs, and all his tortured efforts could not raise them to beyond an agonized horizontal. The door had opened. The nephew was feeling for the electric light switch just inside. It was a moment for one of the superlative achievements of panic. Mr. Mannering was well equipped for the occasion. Suddenly, at the cost of indescribable effort, he succeeded in raising the right frond, not straight upwards, it is true, but in a series of painful jerks along a curve outward and backward, and ascending by slow degrees till it attained the position of an arm held over the possessor's head from behind. Then, as the light flashed on, a spray of leaves at the very end of his frond spread out into a fan, rather like a very fleshy horse chestnut leaf in structure, and covered the anxious face below. What a relief! And now the nephew advanced up into the orchid house, and now the hidden pair simultaneously remembered the fatal presence of the cat. Simultaneously also, their very sap stood still in their veins. The nephew was walking along by the plant. The cat, a sagacious beast, knew with the infallible intrusion of its kind that this was an idler, a parasite, a sensualist, gross and brutal, disrespectful of age, insolent to weakness, barbarous to cats. Therefore, it remained very still, trusting to its low and somewhat retired position on the plant, and to protective mimicry in such things, and to the half-drunken condition of the nephew, to avoid his notice. But all in vain. "What?" said the nephew. "What? A cat?" And he raised his hand to offer a blow to the harmless creature. Something in the dignified and unflinching demeanor of his victim must have penetrated into his besotted mind, for the blow never fell, and the bully, a coward at heart, as bullies invariably are, shifted his gaze from side to side to escape the steady, contemptuous stare of the courageous cat. Alas, his eye fell on something glimmering whitely behind the dark foliage. He brushed it aside, the intervening leaves, that he might see what it was. It was Cousin Jane. "Oh, said the young man in great confusion. "You're back! But what are you hiding there for?" His sheepish stare became fixed. His mouth opened in bewilderment. Then the true condition of things dawned upon his mind. Most of us would have at once instituted some attempt at communication, or at an assistant of some kind, or at least have knelt down to thank our Creator that we had, by His grace, been spared such a fate, or perhaps have made haste from the orchid house to insure against accidents. But alcohol had so inflamed the young man's hardened nature that he felt neither fear, nor awe, nor gratitude. As he grasped the situation, a devilish smile overspread his face. He said, "But where's the old man?" He peered about the plant, looking eagerly for his uncle. In a moment he had located him, and raising the inadequate visor of leaves, discovered beneath it the face of our hero, troubled with 100 bitter emotions. "Hello, Narcissus," said the nephew. A long silence ensued. The spiteful wretch was so pleased that he could not say a word. He rubbed his hands together and licked his lips and stared as a child might at a new toy. "Well, you're properly up a tree," he said. "Yes, the tables are turned now, all right, aren't they? Do you remember the last time we met?" A flicker of emotion passed over the face of the suffering blossom, betraying consciousness. "Yes, you can hear what I say," added the tormentor. "Feel, too, I expect. What about that?" As he spoke, he stretched out his hand, and seizing a delicate frill of fine silvery filaments that grew as whiskers grow around the lower half of the flower, he administered a sharp tug. Without pausing to note, even in the interest of science, the subtler shades of his uncle's reaction, content with the general effort of that devastating winch, the wretch chuckled with satisfaction, and taking a long pull from the reeking butt of the stolen cigar, puffed the vile fumes straight into his victim's center. The brute. "How do you like that, John the Baptist?" he asked with a leer. "Good for the blight, you know. Just what you want." Something rustled upon his coat sleeve. Looking down, he saw a long stalk, well adorned with the fatal tendrils, groping its way over the arid and unsatisfactory surface. In a moment, it had reached his wrist. He felt it fasten, but knocked it off as one would a leech before it had time to establish its hold. "Ugh," he said. "So that's how it happens, is it? I think I'll keep outside till I get the hang of things a bit. I don't want to be made an Aunt Sally of, though I shouldn't think they could get you with your clothes on." Struck by a sudden thought, he looked from his uncle to Cousin Jane, and from Cousin Jane back to his uncle again. He scanned the floor and saw a single crumpled bathrobe lying in the shadow. "Well," and with an odious backward leer, he made his way out of the orchid house. Mr. Mannering felt that his suffering was capable of no increase. Yet he dreaded the morrow. His fevered imagination patterned the long night with waking nightmares, utterly fantastic visions of humiliation and torture. Torture! It was an absurd, of course, for him to fear cold-blooded atrocities on the part of his nephew, but how he dreaded some outrageous whim that might tickle the youth's sense of humor and lead him to any wanton freak, especially if he were drunk at the time. He thought of slugs and snails, espaliers and topiary. If only the monster would rest content with insulting jests, with wasting his substance, ravaging his cherished possessions before his eyes, with occasional pulling at the whiskers even, then it might be possible to turn gradually from all that still remained in him of man, to subdue the passions, no longer to admire or desire, to go native as it were, relapsing into the nirvana of a vegetable dream. But in the morning he found this was not so easy. In came the nephew, and pausing only to utter the most perfunctory of jeers at his relatives in the glass house, he sat at the desk and unlocked the top drawer. He was evidently in search of money. His eagerness betrayed that. No doubt he had run through all he had filched from his uncle's pockets, and had not yet worked out a scheme for getting direct control of his bank account. However, the drawer held enough to cause the scoundrel to rub his hands with satisfaction, and summoning the housekeeper to bellow into her ear a reckless order upon the wine and spirits merchant. "Get along with you," he shouted, when he at last made her understand. "I shall have to get someone a bit more on the spot to wait on me, I can tell you that. Yes," he added to himself, as the poor old woman hobbled away, deeply hurt by his bullying manner. "Yes, a nice little parlor maid." He hunted in the telephone book for the number of the local registry office. That afternoon he interviewed a succession of maidservants in his uncle's study. Those that had happened to be plain or too obviously respectable he treated curtly and coldly. They soon made way for others. This was only when a girl was attractive, according to the young man's depraved tastes, and also bore herself in a fast or brazen manner, that the interview was at all prolonged. In these cases the nephew would conclude in a fashion that left no doubt in the minds of any of his auditors as to his real intentions. Once, for example, leaning forward, he took the girl by the chin, saying in an odious smirk, "There's no one else but me, and so you'd be treated just like one of the family. Do you see, my dear?" To another he would say, slipping his arm around her waist, "Do you think we shall get on well together?" After this conduct had sent 2 or 3 in confusion from the room, there entered a young person of the most regrettable description, one whose character, betrayed as it was in her meretricious finery, her crude cosmetics, and her tinted hair, showed yet more clearly in florid gesture and too facile smile. The nephew lost no time in coming to an arrangement with this creature. Indeed, her true nature was so obvious that the depraved young man only went through the farce of an ordinary interview as a sauce to his anticipations, enjoying the contrast between conventional dialogue and unbridled glances. She was to come the next day. Mr. Mannering feared more for his unhappy cousin than for himself. What scenes may she not have to witness, he thought, that yellow cheek of hers to incarnadine, if only he could have said so in a few words. But that evening, when the nephew came to take his ease in his study, it was obvious that he was far more under the influence of liquor than he had been before. His face, flushed patchily by the action of the spirits, wore a sullen sneer. An ominous light burned in that bleared eye. He muttered savagely under his breath. Clearly this fiend in a human shape was what is known as fighting drunk. Clearly some trifle had set his vile temper in a blaze. It is interesting to note, even at this stage, a sudden change in Mr. Mannering's reactions. They now seemed entirely egotistical, and were to be elicited only by stimuli directly associated with physical matters. The nephew kicked a hole in the screen in his drunken fury. He flung a burning cigar end down on the carpet. He scratched matches on the polished table. His uncle witnessed this with the calm of one whose sense of property and of dignity has become numbed and paralyzed. He felt neither fury nor mortification. Had he, by one of those sudden strides by which all such development takes place, approached much nearer to his goal, complete vegetation? His concern for the threatened modesty of Cousin Jane, which had moved him so strongly only a few hours earlier, must have been the last dying flicker of exhausted altruism. That most human characteristic had faded from him. The change, however, in its present stage, was not an unmixed blessing. Narrowing in from his wider and more expressly human regions of his being, his consciousness now left outside its focus not only pride and altruism, which had been responsible for much of his woe, but fortitude and detachment also, which, with quotations from the Greek, had been his support before the whole battery of his distresses. Moreover, within its constricted circle, his ego was not reduced, but concentrated. His serene, flower-like indifference toward the ill usage of his furniture was balanced by the absorbed, flower-like single-mindedness of his terror at the thought of similar ill usage directed toward himself. Inside the study, the nephew still fumed and swore. On the mantelpiece stood an envelope, addressed in Mr. Mannering's handwriting to Cousin Jane. In it was the letter he had written from town, describing his nephew's disgraceful conduct. The young man's eyes fell upon this, and unscrupulously, impelled by idle curiosity, he took it up and drew out the letter. As he read, his face grew 100 times blacker than before. "What?" he muttered. "A mere race-course cad, a worthless vulgarian, a scoundrel of a sneaking sort. And what's this? Cut him off absolutely? What?" said he, with a horrifying oath. "Would he cut me off absolutely? Two can play at that game, you old devil!" And he snatched up a large pair of scissors that lay on the desk and burst into the hothouse. Among fish, the dory, they say, screams when it is seized upon by a man. Among insects, the caterpillar of the death's-head moth is capable of a still, small shriek of terror. In the vegetable world, only the mandrake could voice its agony. Till now. Wow! That was horrifying! Man, Raymond and I certainly would have represented Mr. Mannering in court against his nephew, even if he was a plant. The legal action team is the foremost authority on Kaiju law. We've even gotten a few Ultramans exonerated on the collateral damage caused by their fights with monsters. All that to say, if you're a monster, big or small, hearing this, and you need legal help, call the Monster Island Legal Action Team at 555-MILAT. Wow. Nick's shameless self-promotion is certainly rubbing off on me. Aw, Della's dropping my ankle. Come here, little lady. Oh, you're such a good girl. You helped me get through the story. Oh.
Wowee! That was Ohio, bro.
The American state, or my native tongue's word for good morning? Are you staring at me? You have no eyes, so I can't tell.
No, I'm mewing.
Like Gary's cat.
I bet she's delish. Feed me, Gary. Feed me all night long.
Wait a damn minute. You're one of Audrey 2's saplings.
Oh, detritus.
I should have known.
I'm so cooked.
Lucky for you, I don't eat sentient beings. Often.
Bruh, I'm so gonna crash out.
Speak English.
I am, Unc. Why are you so salty?
Get off my show, Audrey. Wait. Which number are you?
6, 7, or maybe 69.
Get out!
Fine. I'm totally Sigma anyway. I don't need you. Motherfucker. Gotta get around here by myself. I have such a fat gap.
Well, there you have it, monster children. The story that inspired not one, but 2 cult classic films. But it's only part of a large legacy of frightful stories involving plants, which include 1894's The Flowering of the Strange Orchid by H.G. Wells, 1951's The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, 1956's The Reluctant Orchid by Arthur C. Clarke, and of course, the 1989 film Godzilla vs. Biollante. Flowers are beautiful things that require constant care. So it's no wonder they become objects of obsession for the lonely and the reclusive. These plants take on a life of their own, and if only in the delusional minds of their caregivers, until they become all-consuming, figuratively and literally. The fanatic sacrifices himself, body and soul, to the blossom he worships, willing to do anything for the plant, even the most unspeakable of evils. Nature may create monsters to humble humanity, but nothing compares to the monsters their zealots become.
The Kaiju Krypt presents Green Thoughts by John Collier, starring Damon Noyes as Vinnie Kami and Gary Steward, and Shane Cochran as Andre 67. Written, directed, produced, and edited by Nathan Marchand. Music tracks included The Zombies Ate John Carpenter by Terranigma. Sound effects sourced from freesound.org and created by J.P. Gant. Our story segments were made possible by the generous MIFE Max members on Patreon, including executive producer Damon Noyes. This is a fan production, and no copyright infringement is intended or implied. All characters, video clips, audio clips, and text belong to their respective copyright holders. MIFE is a Moonlighting Ninjas media production and a proud member of Pawn Nation. Thank you for listening. Happy Halloween!